All right, everybody, it's 9 o'clock. Let's go ahead and get this party started. I will apologize in advance. I'm on the tail end of a sinus infection. So if I fall into a coughing fit, I'll recuperate as quickly as possible. And I'll try to mute myself so I'm not offending all of you with the noises coming out of my body. Thank you so much, especially to those of you who have decided to spend another morning with me today. If you survived last week and you came back for more, you're my kinds of gluttons for punishment. A few ground rules, just as a reminder, please keep yourself on mute unless you are asking a question, but please do ask questions out loud just so I don't have to monitor the chat box. It's a little challenging for me to teach and monitor and do all of those things all at once. And then I will send the slide deck and a link to the class recording to everybody who's registered via email after the class later today. So you won't have to ask for that. It'll just go out automatically. All right, you know I love my polls, so let's go ahead and get started with the first one. True or false, the seller is required to provide a clue report to the buyer. True or false, the SPUDs must be provided to the buyer within 5 days of contract acceptance. And true or false, if the home was built prior to 1978, the seller must complete the LBP disclosure and provide that to the buyer. Five seconds. All right, let's look at some of these results. So poll one, true, false, the seller is required to provide a clue report to the buyer. That's actually false, but for somebody who put false, I'd love for you to tell me why that's false. Nobody? We just
Yes,
guessed?
me. Because it's for the seller side, because it's the reclaim, it's the claim for the house they selling.
Yes. So this is an old way of thinking. Once upon a time, the contract did require a clue report. A clue report is a very specific document. It's a comprehensive loss underwriting exchange form. And what we were experiencing was that many insurance companies would not provide that directly to a consumer, or they would charge for it, or you'd have to go to someplace like LexisNexis to retrieve one. So while you could provide this if you had access to it, the seller is not required to provide this specific document. They simply have to provide some sort of evidence of claims history. That could be a letter of experience. It could even be a letter from the seller themselves, although not ideal. We really want to see it from an insurance company if there was insurance on the house. So I know a lot of us old school agents, especially, we still refer to this as a clue report. That is not accurate. So I just want you to remove that from your vocabulary. The SPUDs must be provided to the buyer within 5 days of contract acceptance. That is also false. Somebody who put false, tell me why.
3 days.
3 days, that is correct.
I put 5 days at first, and I thought, wait a minute, one of those ones where it's 3 days, and I'm like, change it.
We're so used to so many things. I mean, really, we like 3 days and 5 days in our contract a lot. But I think we're so used to disclosure based things having 5 day response times that that's just customary. But that is 100% correct. It's 3 days. True or false? If the home was built prior to 1978, the seller must complete the LBP disclosure and provide that to the buyer. That is true. And the takeaway that I want you to have from this is that document itself that is provided through your AAR forms, that must be completed by the seller first, meaning that you representing the buyer should not originate this document with the offer forms. Because what are they acknowledging? What is a buyer acknowledging on the bottom of that document if the seller hasn't made disclosures already on the top? So if you are making an offer on a home that was built prior to 1978, please reach out to the listing agent and request a copy of this lead-based paint disclosure. Do not create one of your own. All right, well done, guys. So we're on section 4, and it's all about disclosure. So the very first one, the seller's property disclosure statement, or the SPUDS. Seller shall deliver a completed AAR residential SPUDS form to buyer within 3 days after contract acceptance. Buyer shall provide notice of any SPUDS items disapproved within the inspection period or 5 days after receipt of the SPUDS, whichever is later. So this did used to be 5 days. However, I'm taking credit for all of these contract changes, obviously. The risk management committee decided that 3 days was better. And the reason for that is to make sure that the buyer has those SPUDS in advance of any inspections, in case they want their inspector to pay a little more attention to something that may have been referenced on the SPUDS, like a previous leak somewhere. So that's why we bumped it up by a couple of days, just so that we have more time to get our hands on that prior to buyer inspections. Insurance claims history. Seller shall deliver to buyer a written 5-year insurance claims history regarding the premises, or a claims history for the length of time seller has owned the premises if less than 5 years. So if they've only lived there for a year, they only need to provide insurance history for 1 year. If they've lived there for 20 years, they only have to provide insurance history for 5 years. From seller's insurance company or an insurance support organization or consumer reporting agency, or if unavailable from these sources, from seller within 5 days after contract acceptance. Buyer shall provide notice of any items disapproved within the inspection period or 5 days after receipt of the claims history, whichever is later. Okay, so both the insurance claims history and the SPUDS have that, or 5 days after receipt, whichever is later. This is critical for you as listing agents to ensure that you have these documents as quickly as possible, because if you prolong this, you are giving the buyer additional opportunities to cancel later on in the transaction that they really shouldn't have otherwise. My best recommendation as a listing agent is have the sellers complete the SPUDS and get their insurance claims history letter to you before you even go on the market. Yes, there may need to be updates. There are forms for those, specifically your notice disclosure form. But ultimately, I would want these in hand. I don't want them to be scrambling and forget things after we already are under contract and they're just trying to meet a deadline. It's best to have these upfront, ready to go the second we accept an offer. Foreign sellers. The Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act, FIRPTA, is applicable if seller is a non-resident alien, individual, foreign corporation, foreign partnership, foreign trust, or foreign estate, foreign person. Seller agrees to complete, sign, and deliver to escrow company a certificate indicating whether seller is a foreign person. FIRPTA requires that a foreign seller may have federal income taxes up to 15% of the purchase price withheld unless an exception applies. Seller is responsible for obtaining independent legal and tax advice. If you are making an offer on a property, ideally, the seller and the listing agent are aware if FIRPTA will apply. However, if that is not already marked in the MLS, I would definitely encourage you look at the mailing address or the tax mailing address in Monsoon and see if it happens to be in a different country, specifically Canada, as that's a pretty good sign that we likely will have a FIRPTA situation and we want to get that clarified. Lead-based paint disclosure. If the premises were built prior to 1978, if they were built in 1978, this does not apply. It is prior to 1978. Seller shall notify buyer of any known lead-based paint, LBP, or LBP hazards in the premises. Provide buyer with any LBP risk assessments or inspections of the premises in seller's possession. Provide buyer with the disclosure of information on lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazards, and any report, records, pamphlets, and or other materials referenced therein, including the pamphlet Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home, collectively LBP information. Buyer shall return a signed copy of the disclosure of information on lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazards to seller prior to COE. Okay, so that's your lead-based paint disclosure form that I was talking about that we need to have signed. I know that this puts a lot of onus on the seller for doing all these things. I have to tell you, in all my years and all my transactions, I've never had a situation where there were actual lead-based paint disclosures that the seller had in their possession or was aware of their existence. I think a lot of that has to do with all the remodeling, obviously, that we've had since the 70s, full remodels in many cases. And the buyer advisory does contain the pamphlet that is being referenced here. So that's not something that the seller has to provide separately to the buyer if the home was built prior to 1978. So just kind of as a heads up, that's not something separate that needs to be done. Then you have two boxes. If lead-based paint does not apply, you needn't mark either of these boxes. Okay, if the home was built in 1978 or later, lead-based paint does not apply. Lead-based paint information will not pertain to this transaction, so these boxes would be left blank. You would only mark one of these if the premises were built prior to 1978, because we're going to ultimately make one of the following determinations. Lead-based paint information was provided prior to contract acceptance, and buyer acknowledges the opportunity to conduct LBP risk assessments or inspections during the inspection period. Or, more commonly, seller shall provide LBP information within 5 days after contract acceptance. Buyer may, within 10 days or blank days after receipt of the LBP information, conduct or obtain a risk assessment or inspection of the premises for the presence of LBP or LBP hazards, assessment period. Buyer may, within 5 days after receipt of the LBP information or 5 days after expiration of the assessment period, cancel this contract. I see more people mark that box than any other, and I think really it's just for that first sentence, that if the seller does have any LBP information, they'll provide it within 5 contract days. However, 173 is predominantly sufficient for all of us. The buyer already has that 10-day inspection period. So if there are any concerns about LBP, ideally we knew that up front, right? Because we requested that LBP disclosure from the seller before we submitted our offer. And now we have our 10-day standard inspection period to conduct any additional assessments should we need them. So I think 173 is the more practical application, but you're not in trouble using either one necessarily. Just know that potentially any delay in the seller providing that information and that disclosure may ultimately give the buyer additional time to cancel the contract. Buyer is further advised to use certified contractors to perform renovation, repair, or painting projects that disturb lead-based paint in residential properties built before 1978, and to follow specific work practices to prevent lead contamination. So that's just a little warning in case the buyers elect to do some remodeling after they buy the home. And then this is this is confusing, and even to our AI systems that automatically fill in where buyers should be initialing and signing things in some of your signing software, because it says buyer's initials required on both of these lines, but they're only required on the one that actually applies. So if premises were constructed prior to 1978, they're going to sign line 81. If they were constructed in 1978 or later, they're going to initial on line 182. Not both. The house was either built prior to 1978 or 1978 or later. So double check. Like I said, I know for the longest time, some of our digital signing software was automatically putting initials on both of these lines. We need to be sure that it's only on one. Questions on disclosures? All right. Poll 2. Look how, oh, yes, Lisa.
Hi, good morning. So I don't have the SPUDS form in front of me, but are there any specific sellers, an example, like if it's an estate sale or tenants occupied in the property and the seller hasn't lived in the property, that would be exempt from doing the SPUDS form?
So this is probably a longer answer than you necessarily need, but I'm going to give you the full rundown. There is no exemption in Arizona for providing disclosures, meaning that it is a statutory requirement to disclose everything you know about the house. Now, we understand in those types of situations, your disclosures will be limited, right? Because the person who has acquired the property likely doesn't know much more than maybe who owns the property, how long it's been vacant, or if there's an interim occupant, who the utility companies are, that sort of thing. So while they don't necessarily have to provide a SPUDS, they do have to provide disclosures. And the SPUDS is just the easiest way to do that because the SPUDS includes questions about, in essence, previous litigation or arbitration items that have been brought to the table because of a lack of disclosure. So here is my advice for any of those unique situations. Complete everything you possibly know or reasonably should know, especially if you do have your hands on receipts or you personally had contractors come out and do something to the property in preparation for putting it on the market. But in the additional, there's a little section at the very end for additional information that the buyer may need to know. Just have them write in there that the seller / owner of the property has never occupied the premises and has limited knowledge.
Perfect. Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. I know this is, I see this so often, and it's unwise is what it boils down to, guys. So from a seller perspective, I'm like, why would the seller ask the buyer to waive the SPUDS? And I don't know, honestly, I think a lot of it's just laziness or because they do fear that they may improperly disclose something. But the way that our SPUDS is written is, hey, do you know? Like if you don't know of it, then the answer is just no. It's not saying no, this doesn't exist. It's saying I have no knowledge of this existing. The worst thing any seller can do is not provide a SPUDS at all. So if you represent the seller, whatever their circumstances, let them know that it is in their best interest to provide a SPUDS and any disclosures they possibly have to ensure that they don't get sued in the future. It takes 10 years to go through these polls. All right, poll number 2. True or false, the AAR purchase contract has an as-is clause. True or false, if the seller is in receipt of a previous appraisal for the property and that appraisal reflects a lower than list price, the seller must disclose that amount. And true or false, the buyer must disclose if they are in the midst of a divorce when submitting an offer. I have more seconds. All right, true or false? The AAR purchase contract has an as-is clause. That is true. It is not labeled as is, which is why I think some folks get confused by this. But as we will find today, it says that the property is being sold in its present physical condition, aka as is. There is no obligation for the seller to make repairs, aka as is. If the seller is in receipt of a previous appraisal for the property and that appraisal reflects a lower than list price, the seller must disclose that amount. That is false. They must not. You will see here in just a few minutes why that is. And the last one, the buyer must disclose if they are in the midst of a divorce when submitting an offer. Oh, this is a pretty good split. Okay, for somebody who said yes, tell me why they must disclose that.
Leah, can you hear me?
I can.
I just put yes because it could potentially interfere with the close, perhaps.
Yeah, that's the answer right there. So really, and I didn't do this intentionally because anytime I put maybe or perhaps, that's the one you all seem to select because you just assume that's the correct answer. But at the end of the day, that's the factor, right? That's the nuance that we have to know. Will the divorce affect the transaction? Is the spouse already signing a disclaimer or a quitclaim deed right at the onset? Is there anything that's going to change with financing? If we look at the prequal, is the lender aware that there is a separation and a potential divorce? Like these are some additional questions. So they may or may not need to. I would probably lean in the direction of they should. So just in case something does come back to bite them on this situation, they are not ultimately going to lose their earnest money because they failed to disclose a material fact that could adversely affect the seller. So again, that's a maybe, but leaning in the direction of yes, again, unless everything is really clear cut and it's not going to be an issue.
Leah,
Yes.
doesn't that go with especially with dual agency, that's one of those personal things that you wouldn't divulge just because it's personal and they could use
Well,
it on the
no,
other side?
just because something's confidential in nature doesn't automatically mean that it's not a material disclosure item. So if that confidential information, in essence, can impede the transaction, it's no longer confidential. So again, you're having that conversation up front with your buyer. We're consulting with the lender. We're ensuring that they have everything they need because there's also different stages of divorce, right? Where this legitimately might be on the tail end and it's definitely not a problem. They already have a court order, in essence, that allows the spouses to buy their own homes. There are other circumstances. But if none of that has happened, and we've seen this, where in essence, the buyer is trying to buy a house and their soon-to-be ex-spouse has no idea, and this is about to become community property, and then they're refusing to sign, it's a big ordeal. So that must be disclosed to the seller.
Well, at that time though, right? I mean, do you have to disclose right away or can you wait until, okay, hey, look, this is happening?
No, I think you need to disclose right away. If you don't have everything lined up where the buyer has sole authority to purchase a house without anything needed from the spouse, I think that's a material disclosure item.
Okay.
Anybody else? All right, there were a couple of little disclosure things left. So the affidavit of disclosure, not super common. For my folks who do land, you're more likely to see this than the rest of us. But if the premises are located in an unincorporated area of the county and 5 or fewer parcels of property other than subdivided property are being transferred, seller shall deliver a completed affidavit of disclosure in the form required by law to buyer within 5 days after contract acceptance. Buyer shall provide notice of any affidavit of disclosure items disapproved within the inspection period or 5 days after receipt of the affidavit of disclosure, whichever is later. So with that, if an affidavit is required, almost always the title company will let you know. They will also courtesy record this affidavit for you when the time comes after the deal has closed. So just double check that. Like I said, especially if you're dealing in Maricopa, unincorporated areas, a lot of times your tax records will reflect that. You kind of know what you're dealing with. In this affidavit of disclosure, it's in your forms as well. So you can see what's being requested. Changes during escrow. Seller shall immediately notify buyer of any changes in the premises or disclosures made herein in the SPUDs or otherwise. Such notice shall be considered an update of the SPUDs. Unless seller is already obligated by this contract or any amendments hereto to correct or repair the changed item disclosed, buyer shall be allowed 5 days after delivery of such notice to provide disapproval or notice of disapproval to seller. Jenner, yes.
Sorry, I had to unmute. Back on affidavit of disclosure,
Yes.
because I do land, hot tip, when we send that disclosure out via Breeze for them to complete, save that blank one that they completed without their signature to send to title because title will require them to fill it out by hand. My clients don't like that. They already filled it out.
That is a good hot tip. Is that
Yeah.
is that because they're notarizing them before they send them for recordation?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's prettier when it's the one that they completed and it's all typed up and beautiful. It just, they sign it at closing. So
Excellent. No, that's a
appreciate it.
great tip. Thank you for sharing that. So changes during escrow, real quickly, as we will find, the contract requires that the seller shall maintain or repair the premises should anything change during escrow. So with that in mind, what might be an updated disclosure then that would allow the buyer to cancel? What might happen to a property that a seller simply, it's not something that could be fixed. And ultimately that would allow the buyer to cancel. Any ideas?
A fire? Flood?
Yeah, I would agree. A fire would absolutely be a big one. That would probably thwart the transaction in its steps, right? Like that's ultimately now we've got insurance involved. Potentially, it couldn't be rebuilt. Like there's a lot that goes into that. Absolutely. Delisa, you came up with a really, really good big one, and I'm like, a snake was found on the property. Something that ultimately, I mean, you could remove that snake, but now we know that snakes could be on the premises, and that's not really something that you, a seller, can correct. That will be corrected for all time. So that something like that, or scorpions, could ultimately allow a buyer to cancel and get their earnest money back.
Wow.
Yeah.
Leah,
Yes.
I had unincorporated area. This lady, when she went to check it out, she saw a snake and she canceled because of the snake. But I think it's kind of funny because we do live in the desert and this was way out in the middle of nowhere. They do
I
live
think that's
around
common
here.
sense. Yeah. Although I'm telling you right now, Jen, if I saw a snake in my yard, I'm like, we're moving. We
Oh,
would burn the
okay.
house down and be like, we're
Oh,
out of
okay,
here.
okay. Got it, got
But
it.
I'm also not out in an unincorporated area, looking at desert stuff.
Right.
Yeah, no, snakes are not
Yeah.
my thing.
Leah,
Yes.
I'm thinking termites might be a problem too.
So termites potentially, but termites are quite treatable, especially the type in Arizona. I know that we hear termites and we start freaking out about it. And generally speaking, that wouldn't necessarily be a change during escrow, only because the buyer should be conducting a termite inspection, which we'll get to during the inspection parts. So potentially, but termites usually, to my knowledge, can be treated and then they come with a warranty. And the buyer would discover that during their inspection period, which at that point they absolutely could get out. Scorpions, however, you can't treat. You can try to deny them of their food source, which is predominantly crickets, but there's actually no spray or no remediation process for scorpions or snakes.
Well, they like feet too.
Yeah, they do indeed.
Yes, they do.
Anybody else?
Well, this is John. I was thinking of a remediation issue like diesel fuel in the soil, stuff like that.
Oh, absolutely. And those are obviously major issues, right? I
Yeah.
think that that's a no-brainer that for something like that, absolutely the buyer could go ahead and cancel. There are even more extenuating circumstances that I have seen that are specific to that buyer. So we did have an issue where after the inspections were done, there was a major, major leak and mold was discovered. So even though the seller was obligated to repair and remediate the leak and the subsequent mold, this buyer was so sensitive, medically sensitive to mold, that they backed out and they got their earnest money back. And I think that's reasonable. That ultimately, even though something was done to correct it, the very possibility that there could be any remnants or that was there in the first place, the title company sided with the buyer and said, yes, for circumstances like this, we'll allow you to cancel and get your earnest money back. So you just never know for sure. All right, getting into warranties. So there's just a few clauses here, but condition of premises. Okay, so this is where I said AKA as is. Buyer and seller agree that premises are being sold in its present physical condition as of the date of contract acceptance. Seller makes no warranty to buyer, either express or implied, as to the condition, zoning, or fitness for any particular use or purpose of the premises. However, seller shall maintain and repair the premises so that at the earlier of possession or COE, the premises, including all personal property included in the sale, will be in substantially the same condition as on the date of contract acceptance. And all personal property not included in the sale and debris will be removed from the premises. I'm going to pause there for just a second. So, as is, and that just means, again, that the seller is up. Once upon a time, guys, our contract actually had a thing called warranted items. And those were the major controls, in essence, in the house, the major systems of the house had to be operational. So if anything was discovered, like your HVAC system was not working, your seller was legally obligated to repair that HVAC system. Okay, we got rid of that. And in doing so, now everything is as is, okay, which just means it's all negotiable. However, if the seller and buyer have agreed, let's say, to leave the refrigerator, personal property, to convey with the house, and that refrigerator stops working a week before close of escrow, the seller will have to repair or replace the refrigerator because of this clause right here. Okay, so if anything breaks or busts during the contract period, during escrow, the seller is obligated to repair it to ensure that it is working. So make sure you're having that conversation with your seller so that they know that potentially this is what they can expect. Also, we have all of these things about homes are supposed to be cleaned prior to the buyer moving in. There's nothing in the contract that says that. Okay, the only reference to anything remotely similar is this subsection that says all personal property not included in the sale and debris will be removed from the premises. That's it. Not clean, just don't have shit laying around the house. Sometimes that's a legitimate thing even, which is disgusting, but welcome to the REO days. Lacey.
Hi, Leah.
Good morning.
So how does this impact once we get the title report at the end if there's violation for weeds or whatever on there?
Okay, so that's not the title report. Those are your HOA documents.
Sorry, yes.
Which comes from title. So I understand kind of where that was coming from. It means it's negotiable.
Okay, so they are not required to repair it even if it's in violation of the HOA?
Correct. So what that does, that actually falls into update to your disclosures. So now we've been notified that the property is in violation of certain things with the HOA, and either the seller corrects them or the buyer can take them over, or the buyer, if the seller is unwilling, the buyer can cancel and get their earnest money back because that's an update to the SPUDs.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So I'm going to reference this a couple of times today, but I am going to send out Leah's contract clauses with my recap later this afternoon because one of the things that I recommend when you are representing buyers is nip that exact situation in the bud, because I have a clause that says, hey, if any HOA violations are discovered, the seller is going to take care of them. So then you don't have to worry about this becoming a problem later down the road or after the fact, especially some of these where it's like, hey, the whole house has to be repainted. That's a chunk of change and it's a frustrating situation. So it's just one of those things that you can easily be proactive about. And what's hilarious is most sellers are going to sign this without any concern because they believe that their home is just fine. So they're like, oh yeah, we're not worried about it. We haven't received any violation notices. You go to sell your home and request the package and boom, all of a sudden they have to repaint their house. So this is just, it's a good, like I said, proactive measure just to make sure that we're not battling, negotiating over HOA violations at the end of the day.
Sorry, Leah, can I ask you one more question on that?
Yeah, of course.
So on the last purchase deal that I had, the seller actually had 4 notices of violation from the HOA and didn't inform their listing agent. So the listing agent was just going to be kind and do it until I discovered that that's not true. He had received 4 violations on the property. So is that something, if I were in the listing agent's position, how would you handle that?
I don't know. How badly do I want to be rid of these clients and have the home sold? And what are we talking about? Like, are we talking about repainting the house? Or are we talking about, hey, we need to pull some weeds? And like I had a listing, all the stupid violation was there was like some decorative film over a front window. Yeah, I just went and peeled it off.
No, this yard was atrocious. I'll bet whoever the landscaper was spent, it was a few $100s to get it cleaned up.
Yeah, I mean, would I throw a few $100s at a property all day long to get it sold in this market as a listing agent? Yeah, you bet I would. So it really is discretionary, but at the end of the day, I would not allow a few $100s to cancel a transaction.
Got it. Put my pride aside.
Hey, it's all about, I don't care about my pride. I care about my pocketbook and paying my bills. So at the end of the day, if I can get a $7,000 commission by throwing $200 at cleaning or landscaping, yeah, I definitely will.
Fair.
All right. Buyer is advised to conduct independent inspections and investigations regarding the premises within the inspection period as specified in Section 6A. Buyer and seller acknowledge and understand they may, but are not obligated to, engage in negotiations or address repairs improvements to the premises. Any all agreed upon repairs improvements will be addressed pursuant to Section 6J. Warranties that survive closing. Seller warrants that seller has disclosed to buyer and brokers all material latent defects and any information concerning the premises known to seller, excluding opinions of value. Okay, that was the appraisal question that we had in our poll. They do not have to disclose that, which materially and adversely affect the consideration to be paid by buyer. Prior to COE, seller warrants that payment in full will have been made for all labor, professional services, materials, machinery, fixtures, or tools furnished within the 150 days immediately preceding COE in connection with the construction, alteration, or repair of any structure on or improvement to the premises. Seller warrants that the information regarding connection to a sewer system or an on-site wastewater treatment facility, septic or alternative, is correct to the best of the seller's knowledge. Okay, so these are a couple of things that they're warning you. If you fail to disclose these things, it can come back and bite you. Unless this is changed, so don't quote me on this, your statute of limitations on disclosure is unlimited, meaning that they could come back 12 years from now and have a problem. Rare, of course, but to my knowledge, that hasn't changed. So if ultimately the seller was aware of something that occurred, so that's what material latent defects mean. Okay, we're not expecting our seller to know something that they'd have no way of knowing. But if they knew that there was a major leak in a bathroom and they had it repaired, they still have to disclose that leak. That's what it's referring to for material latent defects. Buyer warranties. Not many, but this is that divorce situation that we discussed. So buyer warrants that buyer has disclosed to seller any information that may materially and adversely affect buyer's ability to close escrow or complete the obligations of this contract. At the earlier of possession of the premises or COE, buyer warrants to seller that buyer has conducted all desired independent inspections and investigations and accepts the premises. Buyer warrants that buyer is not relying on any verbal representations concerning the premises except disclosed as follows. I will beat you if I see something written into this contract regarding a verbal conversation. No, we're not relying on any verbal representations. If you want something, you're going to make it a provision, a term in the contract itself. So those lines should be blank, or I see a lot of agents on line 211, they just write the word none, that they're not related or relying on any verbal representations. Either of those options is acceptable. Questions on these? A quick little note regarding buyer warranties, because I like to argue this one all the time. It says that may materially and adversely affect buyer's ability to close escrow. That is different than willingness to close escrow. So I have often been involved in arguments regarding, does a buyer need to disclose if they are purchasing a property sight unseen? I say, according to this clause, no, because the fact that they're buying it sight unseen isn't affecting their ability. They're able to buy it. They're just choosing not to. However, I can understand why a seller may want to know that, and ultimately it may be in our client's later best interest to disclose that now so it doesn't bump up as a situation down the road. I would also be hesitant to have a buyer purchase a home sight unseen unless we knew for sure that they were at least going to make it down during their inspection period. So this is an arguable position. Like I said, it's funny how one word can ultimately change how we perceive something in the contract. But just some food for thought, and there is a sight unseen clause in my clauses in case you do opt to use that. All right, moving on. We're getting into the extra fun section, which is due diligence. So next poll, The buyer's inspector found potential mold and recommended that a mold specialist evaluate it. The buyer submitted their Binzer with the following verbiage: seller to have laundry room wall tested for mold and properly remediate if mold exists. Is this a proper Binzer request? True or false? Buyer must send the inspection report to the seller as soon as they receive it. True or false? If a buyer discovers 5 days prior to COE that the property will require flood insurance, they may cancel and get their earnest money back. And true or false? The buyer may conduct an unlimited number of inspections during their inspection period. All right, let's see what we've got. A somewhat decent split on this one. Okay, so is that request for the seller to have laundry room wall tested for mold and properly remediated if mold exists, is that a proper Binzer request? The answer is no. Who put no and why?
Part of the
Because
buyer
it's non-specific.
Oh, we got a couple people talking.
Sorry. Because it's not specific. It could be any wall. So you're not being specific to what wall they're referring to. So it leaves it as, to me, it leaves it to interpretation.
So that is a great point and definitely attaches or discusses the level of specificity, but that's not the biggest problem with this.
It's the buyer's responsibility to do due diligence. That should be their inspection.
That's 100% the problem with this. And yet I see this so frequently on Binzers. It is your buyer's responsibility to conduct any inspections, investigations, and evaluations that are important to them at their expense during their inspection period. So it is improper to ask the seller to test the wall for mold. They needed to test the wall for mold and then have a remediation breakdown that they included in their Binzer. That's what should have occurred.
Leah?
Yes.
I would have, I mean, based on the way I read this, I would have suspected that they would know that because there's the original inspector, which is usually the general inspector that goes around, found potential, recommended a mold specialist, which means a mold specialist goes out and an actual inspector for mold. That's the same difference as getting any other inspection. I would have
Correct.
thought
So the
that
buyer
would have
needs to
been-
do it
Yeah, I would have thought that they would have,
all the time.
if this situation happened, I would think that that would go without saying.
Nope. Oh, it definitely does not. This is probably the biggest issue I see in Binzers is the buyer asking the seller to conduct some sort of testing or evaluation on their behalf. I see it with HVAC systems. I see it with leaks like this. I see it with roofs. There's a lot.
Can I ask a question? So what if they say that there's like they just ask you to correct the mold in the bathroom, but it's not specific, but in the Binzer they're asking for it to be corrected.
Yeah, so that's kind of the workaround to this, right? That as long as we're not asking the seller to conduct any testing for it, to evaluate something or have a contractor evaluate something, if we straight out say, in essence, remove all mold and remediate, then that would be okay. That's a proper request. So it's crazy how just that one little change makes the difference. The problem in some of these situations, and that's probably a little more clear, right? Like, okay, mold very likely exists. We don't need to test the wall for it. We want whatever the black stuff is to be removed and be remediated. There are some circumstances, though, where they don't know what the problem is. And so they're trying to get the seller to conduct some sort of investigation with a contractor because they don't want to pay a contractor to come out and do the inspection. So that's where we see it more frequently. Yeah.
That happened to me, my seller, and he didn't think there was any mold. There wasn't, so he sanded it down, he put some mold repellent and he painted it and he said, that's all I'm doing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and that's just it. That's the risk that you run by not having. It is so much better for the buyer to come in and say, "I want these 7 things done to remediate the mold that was found." Or roof issues or whatever the case may be. It's in their best interest to really know what kind of repair it is that they're asking for.
Leah, I had a quick question.
Yeah.
So if it's the buyer's responsibility to get cultures and to get that tested, it takes a long time. So, like, how does that work if it's past the inspection period and you're having to get it tested and then, like, how does that work if it's
Yeah, so you'd have to be proactive about this. The second there's a discovery of what is likely mold, we need to draft an addendum to extend the inspection period.
Okay, you would just extend it. Okay.
All right, buyer must send the inspection report to the seller as soon as they receive it. This is true, and yet so many of you send it with the Binzer, which I guess is okay, but it's contractually out of compliance. The contract specifies that they will deliver that upon receipt. So as soon as the buyer receives it, they should be forwarding that over to the listing agent, which honestly, guys, is just a sound strategy. Because for sellers who actually have pride in their homes, you will be shocked at the number of times that they start going through that report and just kind of fixing things on their own accord because they want to deliver a good home to the buyer. Others are going to get super frustrated, but this is also a good strategy, right? Because they're going to see this report come in with 172 items on it. They're going to get angry and freak out and talk about how dumb the inspector is. But then a few days later, the actual Binzer comes and the buyer's only asked for 8 items. So overall, it's just a good strategy to get that report sent over ASAP. If a buyer discovers 5 days prior to COE that the property will require flood insurance, they may cancel and get their earnest money back. That is false. They must have their insurance in place within their inspection period. However, they very often do not do this until we are a few days away from closing and the lender says, hey, we need verification or proof of insurance. And that's when they start getting quotes and that's when they send it over. This is a problem. Your buyer needs to be sure that they are securing their homeowner's insurance during their inspection period. The buyer may conduct an unlimited number of inspections during their inspection period. This is true. So any and all inspections that they deem fit or that they want to conduct, they are welcome to do so as long as they provide reasonable notice. Much to the seller's dismay. All right, so number 6, inspection period. Buyer's inspection period shall be 10 days or however many days after contract acceptance. That is calendar days, not business days. During the inspection period, buyer at buyer's expense shall conduct all desired physical, environmental, and other types of inspections and investigations to determine the value and condition of the premises. Heads up, determine the value does not mean an appraisal. Okay, that means that they are independently evaluating if what they offered is a reasonable offer based on now they're discovering what might be wrong with the house or other homes have recently sold. They can cancel based off of that. So they can just determine, hey, we offer too much for the house based on market conditions. That's a reasonable reason to cancel the contract. So just know that. But that value clause right there is not the appraisal. That has its own totally separate section. Make inquiries and consult government agencies, lenders, insurance agents, architects, and other appropriate persons and entities concerning the suitability of the premises in the surrounding area. Investigate applicable building, zoning, fire, health, and safety codes to determine any potential hazards, violations, or defects in the premises, and verify any material multiple listing service information. If the presence of sex offenders in the vicinity or the occurrence of a disease, natural death, suicide, homicide, or other crime on or in the vicinity is a material matter to buyer, it must be investigated by buyer during the inspection period. Buyer shall keep the premises free and clear of liens, shall indemnify and hold seller harmless from all liability claims, demands, damages, and costs, and shall repair all damages arising from the inspections. We've had sellers who have suffered this. So who is responsible for the cost if their home inspector unplugged the refrigerator and left it unplugged and all of the food went bad? Or they were testing the auto reverse function on the garage door, pressed too hard, and they bent the panels. These are the things that, while most good inspectors will have insurance and they personally will cover these things, it's ultimately the buyer's responsibility. So make sure they're choosing wisely. Buyer shall provide seller and brokers, upon receipt at no cost, copies of all inspection reports concerning the premises obtained by buyer. Buyer is advised to consult the Arizona Department of Real Estate Buyer Advisory to assist in buyer's due diligence, inspection, and investigations. So it's laying it all out right there. You've got 10 days or however many days to do whatever you need to do in this property to verify that it is as you want it to be, or we're going to negotiate accordingly. Some other things that need to be done within that time frame. Square footage. Buyer is aware that any reference to the square footage of the premises, both the real property and improvements thereon, is approximate. If square footage is a material matter to buyer, it must be investigated during the inspection period. I don't know that I have ever had a buyer actually measure a property, but I'll tell you where this became a legitimate issue. It was discovered during the appraisal, because the appraiser measured the property, that the house was 400 square feet smaller than was reflected in tax records and in the MLS. Errors happen. The buyer thought that they could cancel because the square footage was less. It appraised. It appraised at the smaller square footage. So we're like, man, you guys would have been getting a bargain if it was actually the size we thought it was. And they thought that they could cancel based off of that. I mean, they could cancel, but they weren't going to get their earnest money back. So just make sure if legitimately the size of their home is concerning to them, despite the fact that they walked through it and it felt fine when they thought it was bigger, that this is something that they have to measure during their inspection period. Wood destroying organism or insect inspection. If current or past wood destroying organisms or insects, such as termites, are a material matter to buyer, these issues must be investigated during the inspection period. I will tell you right now that this is a material matter to pretty much any buyer getting a loan, especially FHA or VA, as they will require a termite treatment letter, if applicable, or the certificate indicating that the house is termite free. Buyer shall order and pay for all wood destroying organism or insect inspections performed during the inspection period. If the lender requires an updated wood destroying organism or insect inspection report prior to COE, it will also be performed at buyer's expense. And the flood hazard. So this was another poll question. Flood hazard designations or the cost of flood hazard insurance shall be determined by buyer during the inspection period. If the premises are situated in an area identified as having any special flood hazards by any governmental entity, the lender may require the purchase of flood hazard insurance. Special flood hazards may also affect the ability to encumber or improve the premises. The cost is the big one. I mean, flood insurance can be thousands and thousands of dollars. So that is going to have some sticker shock if they didn't investigate this during their inspection period. So just, again, make sure that they are taking care of that. Questions on the initial parts of due diligence?
I have a question.
Yes.
So if the inspector like sees like rot wood that looks rotted or something and sticks a screwdriver in it and makes a bigger hole out of it, that's the buyer's responsibility to fix it if they don't move forward with the home?
I mean, technically, yes. I can see the defense on that being, well, it was damaged in the first place and we're going to ask for it to be repaired. And these are tough. I mean, these are hard-won situations when they do occur. They have to be pretty black and white. But yes, I mean, per the contract, they would be responsible for correcting that. Now, here's the wild part about that. They only have to bring it back to how it originally was. So they're not going to replace the whole thing. So, what do you want me to do? You want me to pick it up off the ground and try to stick it back in the hole so it's a little less big? I mean, we have to be somewhat practical.
The reason I'm asking you that too is because the inspector that I've used many times has made a comment about like it's not his, like it's kind of like it's not his problem. So I need to make him aware that it is our problem because ultimately my buyer is the one that's responsible or could be held.
Yeah, and this also falls into, it has to be a reasonable inspection, right? Like it can't be anything invasive, at least not without the seller's permission to do so. So yeah, I don't know that shoving a screwdriver into, you can see that it's rotted wood. I get what he's trying to accomplish, but yeah, I don't know that that's something I would do, quite honestly. You can just barely touch it and you can determine that, yeah, that's dry rot. It needs to be corrected.
Okay, good to know.
Oh, there's there's a red star. Residential resale. Let's get into this. Insurance. If homeowner's insurance is a material matter to buyer, and this is all bold capital letters, so it must be important, buyer shall apply for and obtain written confirmation of the availability and cost of homeowner's insurance for the premises from buyer's insurance company during the inspection period. We've hit on this 4 times now, so you know it's critical, and it happens so infrequently, and it's a problem. That's why we're wanting to make sure everybody's aware. Buyer understands that any homeowner's fire, casualty, flood, or other insurance desired by buyer or required by lender should be in place at COE. If it's cash, they don't have to have homeowner's insurance, but that's just stupid. So yes, they need to make sure that that's in place at COE. The premises are connected to, check a box, sewer system, conventional septic system, or alternative system. Okay, laugh with me when I'm like, alternative system, like an outhouse? That's not what they're talking about. But ultimately, I guess an outhouse could be, but we don't really have those in Arizona anymore. That's a shame. If a sewer connection is a material matter to buyer, it must be investigated during the inspection period. If the premises are served by a conventional septic or alternative system, the AAR on-site wastewater treatment facility addendum is incorporated herein by reference. For sewer connection, of course, they can run a sewer scope. That is one way that they can go ahead and verify it's connected properly. But there are also some resources on the Department of Real Estate website for pulling up like old permits and graphs, things like that, to show that there was actually a sewer connection made. That is included in the buyer advisory. So another reason why we want our buyers to review that very carefully. If we are on a septic or alternative system, like they said, that we'll call it a septic addendum, but it's the on-site wastewater treatment facility addendum. That comes into play. And that says, hey, seller is responsible actually for that inspection and the cost of that inspection and any pumping associated with it. And that must all be done within 20 days of contract acceptance. So that's on its own timeline that is separate from the buyer's due diligence. Of course, the sooner they get that done, the better. So that if there is a problem, again, we're not pushing up to close of escrow where all of a sudden everybody's having to fall out. Swimming pool barrier regulations. During the inspection period, buyer agrees to investigate all applicable state, county, and municipal swimming pool barrier regulations and agrees to comply with and pay all costs of compliance with said regulations prior to occupying the premises unless otherwise agreed in writing, meaning that they negotiated that the seller was going to do something. If the premises contains a swimming pool, buyer acknowledges receipt of the Arizona Department of Health Services approved private pool safety notice. Some brokerages have printed this out and they have that available in their documents, but it's a link inside of your buyer advisory. So at least my agents, we don't require this separate form to be acknowledged by buyers. It's just all in one place. Buyer acknowledgement. Buyer recognizes, acknowledges, and agrees that brokers are not qualified nor licensed to conduct due diligence with respect to the premises or the surrounding area. So don't do it. Buyer is instructed to consult with qualified licensed professional to assist in buyer's due diligence efforts. Because conducting due diligence with respect to the premises and the surrounding area is beyond the scope of brokers' expertise and licensing, buyer expressly releases and holds harmless brokers from liability for any defects or conditions that could have been discovered by inspection or investigation. That doesn't mean that we all won't be sued at the end of the day, just to be super clear. But ultimately, this is our, hey, one, don't advise on these types of things because you are not, even if you are a licensed contractor, don't advise on these types of things. Let them seek their own independent counsel and outside sources for questions related to their inspection findings or how they would correct something or what something would cost. That is not up to you to provide that information. The reason I highlighted all of these requireds is because very often if a home does not have a pool, we see that we have missing buyer initials. We still need the buyer to initial that because if they ever decide to build a pool, they needed to acknowledge the fact that they were aware of what those rules were or where to find those rules. So that's why we have that there. Questions on these?
I'm going to ask another question. So are you saying for the buyer acknowledgement that like even recommending trades is not a good idea? Or
that's okay. You can recommend trades. Just make sure that you're doing so in such a way where it's clear, like, I have nothing to do with them. And there's another part of the contract that covers that too. Like, hey, anybody we recommend, we're not responsible for their actions.
Yeah.
But in this case, yeah, you can absolutely refer them to somebody else. Just you don't be the source.
Okay. Yeah, like saying, oh, I wouldn't worry about that window.
Precisely.
Okay.
Or no, that's only going to cost you about $500 to fix. Don't say those things. All right, inspection period notice. This is probably the most convoluted section. So I'm going to give you all a little piece of advice right now. I have a WTF Binzer class. It is on my YouTube channel. If you have not watched it, I strongly recommend that you do, because it goes into this specific section in great detail. So prior to expiration of the inspection period, buyer shall deliver to seller a signed notice of any items disapproved. AAR's buyer's inspection notice and seller's response, Binzer, form is available for this purpose. Buyer shall conduct all desired inspections and investigations prior to delivering such notice to seller, and all inspection period items disapproved shall be provided in a single notice. Okay, that means you get one shot. Okay, so the legal phrase that they use is one bite at the apple. Anything that you needed to conduct before you submitted your Binzer, because your inspection period ended the second that Binzer was sent over to the seller. Even if you had 10 days, but you sent over the Binzer on day 3, your inspection period was then 3 days, because you have ended it by sending over the Binzer. So they need to make sure that anything that they want to investigate, they are doing prior to sending that Binzer over. And you cannot send multiple Binzers. So if you discover that there was an error on the Binzer you sent, or they've rethought about something and they want to ask for something else, too bad, too late, you missed the window, one bite at the apple. You cannot submit multiple Binzers. So make sure you're getting it all squared away in the first go.
Leah, can I ask you a question on that sort of?
Yes.
So on the last purchase transaction that I did, the seller had listed in the MLS that the seller was willing to put X amount of money towards carpeting in the home, with replacing or removing the carpet in the home. Where should I have put that in any of our documents with the purchase contract addendum or otherwise? How should I have addressed that?
I would have put that in the additional terms of the offer.
Okay, so I accidentally didn't do that because I didn't know. So what happened is I ended up getting an additional $2,000 for my buyer because I had included in the percentage in the purchase contract offer there. And the seller said I didn't have it listed. So I ended up having to create an addendum. So ultimately we ended up getting an additional $2,000 from my buyer that she wasn't expecting. So it worked out, but for future, I just didn't know where to put it.
Yeah, so depending on how you want to handle something like that, if it's actually a specific credit for an item like carpet, that would most likely go in the additional terms. If it's really just going to be money at close of escrow and the buyer can use it however they want, then just put that onto line 100 or 101 of the purchase contract. Make it nice and clean that way, especially for a lender. In this case, I agree. You got kind of lucky that it worked out the way that it worked out. But you don't want to, for those types of things, nothing in the MLS is binding. Okay, so anything that's in the MLS that your buyers want, they need to make sure that that is appearing in the purchase contract somewhere.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Leah, I'm sorry, just a quick question. So with the Binzer, so a few slides before you mentioned that we can have multiple inspections.
Yes.
So if you've had one inspection and you filled out the Binzer and had the buyer initial, then what if you do other inspections, and how does that work if something else is found then at that time? So
yeah, so you're going to have the buyer conduct all inspections prior to doing anything with the Binzer. So generally the order of operations would be you have a general home inspector. They're going to come out and they're going to tell you, hey, you probably want a roofer out here or an HVAC technician or somebody to look at the pool equipment, something to that effect. And then you're going to have those folks come out and explore things on the house, and then they're going to provide their reports. So it's not until all of these inspections have been done that you would do anything with the Binzer.
okay, so it just has to be within that time frame. Okay.
Correct. Yep, exactly. That's the other kind of tight by 10 days. I mean, that it's not very much.
I know. Oh, I keep thinking of that. Yeah.
Quick question, Leah.
Yes.
Is the buyer agent has to know like amount of an estimate that it has to take for the repair in order when they're going to respond to the seller? They have
So
to know like the total amount that will be using.
potentially, for two reasons. One, is the lender going to allow an additional credit, especially if one was already requested? We need to know what that max is, or getting some sort of credit on bins or items is pointless. The second reason would be if that is okay and we have a dollar amount, we want to have that referenced in the binser, which we'll kind of talk about when we get to correct or address. So it's not the buyer's agent's responsibility to get that number. That would be coming from the contractors who are conducting the evaluations on behalf of the buyer.
Okay, because there's something similar that happened recently. The seller agent was asking that we should know like specific amount after the inspection, and it was kind of hard because I did not have like a specialist to know like to give me an estimate of the total amount, but I wasn't quite sure about that, so that's why I just want to know.
Yeah, and that might be a specific circumstance, and I'm happy to look at it kind of offline to see exactly what transpired. But typically speaking, the contractor should be able to provide you with an estimate, and then that estimate number would be the figure that we use if we are asking for a credit. Now, if we're just asking the seller to repair something, then we don't need to have a cost associated with that. That's on the seller to determine what that's going to cost them based on the contractor that they choose.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Right, buyer disapproval. If buyer in buyer's sole discretion disapproves of items as allowed herein, and it's at their sole discretion, so it's allowed herein, buyer shall deliver to seller a signed notice of the items disapproved and state in the notice that buyer elects to either immediately cancel this contract, in which case, if buyer's notice specifies disapproval of items as allowed herein, the earnest money shall be released to buyer. Or if buyer's notice fails to specify items disapproved as allowed herein, the cancellation shall remain in effect, but buyer has to comply with a provision of this contract, and seller may deliver to buyer a cure notice as required by Section 7A. If buyer fails to cure their noncompliance within 3 days after delivery of such notice, buyer shall be in breach and seller shall be entitled to the earnest money. If prior to expiration of the cure period, buyer delivers notice specifying items disapproved as allowed herein, buyer shall be entitled to return of the earnest money. Let's make this a little simple because that's a bunch of mumbo jumbo. If they elect to disapprove of the premises and they are going to cancel, they need to give a reason why. Okay, so they need to list too many roof issues, too many total inspection issues found. Cost to improve property is too high. Found pedophiles in the neighborhood. Whatever that is, that's what they need to put. So they can't just check the box to cancel. They actually need to provide a reason. But let's get into practical measures. Okay, let's say that they don't. They cancel, but they don't actually provide a reason. What this is saying is we, the listing side, need to deliver a cure notice to give the buyer 3 more days to come up with a reason and send a reason to us before the deal, in essence, is done and there's a distribution of earnest money. So while the cancellation is in effect immediately, we're still going back and forth with this cure period and waiting for a response to see who's going to get the earnest money at the end of the day. I personally think this is stupid. If they can cancel for any reason at their sole discretion, why in the world are we extending this process and prolonging it by issuing a cure notice? Just let it be canceled, let the buyer get the earnest money back, and call it a day. But ultimately, you do have the ability to cure them if they failed to provide an actual reason for disapproving of the premises. The better one, however, is the or. Okay, so they didn't elect to immediately cancel the contract. They provide seller an opportunity to correct or address the items disapproved, in which case, so I want to hit on correct or address. Correct means they're going to make repairs. Address means they're going to do something other than make repairs. So this little section that was the change in the contract is what allows a buyer to now ask for a credit or a home warranty or a price reduction in lieu of repairs. But they still must list items disapproved first before they do that. Again, for a full detail on that, watch my WTF Binzer class that goes into extensive detail. But that's what that means by correct or address. Seller shall respond in writing within 5 days or blank days after delivery to buyer of buyer's notice of items disapproved. Seller's failure to respond to buyer in writing within the specified time period shall conclusively be deemed seller's refusal to correct or address any of the items disapproved. Okay? Buyer submits BINSR. 5 days have passed. Seller hasn't responded at all. It means the answer is no. We're not fixing anything. So then buyer will have to decide if they want to proceed with that or not. If seller agrees in writing to correct items disapproved, seller shall correct the items, complete any repairs in a workmanlike manner, and deliver any paid receipts evidencing the corrections and repairs to buyer 3 days or blank days prior to the COE date. I put on there pro tip, use 5 days. 3 days prior to COE is bumping up really close, especially if we're going to have an issue that still needs correction. So on line 280, I strongly recommend you use 5 days or maybe even 7 days prior to COE. If we're going to get things done, if the seller's going to make repairs, we want to have the opportunity to make sure they've been done correctly and they've been done timely. And if we wait that close to closing, we may have an issue where we don't want to close because the repairs haven't been made. If seller is unwilling or unable to correct or address any of the items disapproved, buyer may cancel this contract within 5 days after delivery of seller's response or after expiration of the time for seller's response, whichever occurs first, and the earnest money shall be released to buyer. Okay, so if they respond and we don't like it or they deny us repairs, the buyer can cancel. If the buyer agrees to all repairs, if the seller agrees to make all of the repairs or agrees to address the items from the buyer, then the BINSR is done. We don't need anything further from the buyer. So the buyer's only taking action if they have not agreed to everything or they haven't responded at all. So generally speaking, the time frame is 10 days to submit the BINSR, 5 days for seller's response, 5 days for buyer's response to seller's response. So your full due diligence timeline, in essence, is 20 days potentially. So keep that in mind if you're working with a cash buyer and hoping to close in 2 weeks. You probably need to start modifying some of these timelines.
Leah?
Oh, yes.
I have a question regarding line 277.
Yes.
It says seller's refusal to correct or address any of the items disapproved. But where does it say, so let's say that the seller said, yes, I'm going to correct. No, sorry. I offer this in lieu of repairs. And you know how the third box has to be signed, whether the buyer accepts or not. What if they don't answer? Where does it say? I'm probably missing it. That's an automatic refusal or acceptance. Does that make sense?
No. So the seller is responding that they are going to issue a credit in lieu of repairs?
Correct.
So that's a response.
But you know how compliance says that we have to get a response from the buyer, like, yes,
Correct.
they accept.
Because you responded. You didn't agree to address or correct the repairs or the items as the buyer requested them.
Right. But for the third box, which is the bottom one, where it says the buyer accepts the response or decides to cancel. What if that 5-time period passes and the buyer didn't decide or hasn't responded in writing, checking either box?
Hold on. We're not there yet. Right now, this is just the seller side. That's going to be 287 through 289.
Oh, no wonder I kept looking for it and didn't find it. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so verbal discussions will not extend these time periods. Only a written agreement and addendum signed by both parties will extend response times or cancellation rates. And then, in essence, if the seller has responded, but the buyer does not respond within 5 days to the seller's response, what happens? Buyer's failure to give notice of disapproval of items or cancellation of this contract within the specified time period shall conclusively be deemed buyer's election to proceed. I lied, Katya. We're going to move to the next page. This is if they didn't submit their BINSR in the first place. Election to proceed with the transaction without correction of any disapproved items. So if they didn't submit their BINSR within 10 days, they are moving forward with the property with no repairs, credits, etc. So it's very critical on the buyer side, if that is not their intention, that they get their BINs submitted within their 10-day period. Katya, to go back to you, line 283 to 284. If buyer does not cancel this contract within the 5 days as provided, buyer shall close escrow without those items that seller has not agreed in writing to correct or address. So buyers got that 5-day response time to respond to whatever the seller's response was. If they do not accept or disapprove within that 5 days, it means that they have agreed to it and they are going to proceed with whatever the seller responded with.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, anything else before we move on to the next page? Okay. Home warranty plan, buyer and seller advised to investigate the various home warranty plans available for purchase. The parties acknowledge that different home warranty plans have different coverage options, exclusions, limitations, service fees, and most plans exclude pre-existing conditions. A home warranty plan will be ordered by buyer or seller with the following optional coverage. If you do not know what that is yet, or who it will be issued by, you are welcome to put TBD on these two lines. However, if you are asking the seller to pay for the warranty at a cost not to exceed, you must have a dollar amount in here. Generally speaking, $800 is probably wise. If there's a saltwater pool or if it's a larger home, you likely need to go up. But typically speaking, that will cover most of your warranty plans. And then who to be paid for? Buyer, seller, or split evenly between buyer and seller. If the agent is going to pay for this, it needs to be the agent of the client. Meaning that if the buyer's agent is going to pay for it, mark buyer, and then we will issue a credit on behalf of the buyer at COE. If the seller's agent is going to pay for it, mark seller, and then we will issue a credit on the settlement statement at COE. Or the buyer declines the purchase of a home warranty plan. So something needs to be checked there. Seller grants buyer and buyer's inspectors reasonable access. Okay, so this is kind of what we were talking about before. They shouldn't be digging into things. They shouldn't be lifting flooring. Reasonable access to conduct walkthroughs of the premises for the purpose of satisfying buyer that any corrections or repairs agreed to by seller have been completed and the premises are in substantially the same condition as of the date of contract acceptance. If buyer does not conduct such walkthroughs, buyer releases seller and brokers from liability for any defects that could have been discovered. So it's a really good idea if repairs were made to bring your inspector or contractor back for that final walkthrough, which is another reason why it's a good idea to have in the contract that those repairs will be made 5 to 7 days prior to close of escrow. So we have time to get our contractor and inspector back out there as well to look at things. Seller's responsibility regarding inspections and walkthroughs. Seller shall make the premises available for all inspections. Okay, that was kind of the unlimited poll question. And walkthroughs upon reasonable notice by buyer. Generally speaking, reasonable notice means within a 24-hour notice. Okay, so if we've given you 24 hours, knowing that we're going to be heading in, the seller needs to accommodate that. Seller shall, at seller's expense, have all utilities on, including any propane, until COE to enable buyer to conduct these inspections and walkthroughs. A seller's failure to have all utilities on does not automatically extend the inspection period. You would have to cure them for not having the utilities on, and then we would need an addendum to extend the inspection period. IRS and FIRPTA reporting. The Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act, FIRPTA, provides that if a seller is a foreign person, a buyer of residential property must withhold federal income taxes up to 15% of the purchase price unless an exception applies. If FIRPTA is applicable and buyer fails to withhold, buyer may be held liable for the tax. Buyer agrees to perform any acts reasonable or necessary to comply with FIRPTA and IRS reporting requirements, and buyer is responsible for obtaining independent legal and tax advice. So why is the buyer responsible? Why would the buyer be held liable for the tax? 2 reasons. 1, they're the US citizen. But 2, because the amount of tax withholding is actually determined by how the buyer responds to some occupancy questions. So Leah's little pro tip. If you represent the seller and the purchase price is between 300,000 and $1 million, but we'll just below $1 million, potentially counter offers with my FERPTA clause. And what that FERPTA clause does is it makes the buyer agree right up front that they will comply with occupancy restrictions so that the withholding amount from my seller is only 10% instead of 15%. So if a buyer who is buying a FERPTA property will occupy the premises at least, or they're a direct family member, will occupy it at least half of the time that it is occupied, the withholding is 10% under that $1 million mark. If they are going to use it as a rental, an investment, an STR, the withholding amount is 15%. And I do not want a seller of ours to again have sticker shock at close of escrow because the withholding amount is $45,000 higher than what they believed it was going to be, because the buyers decided, well, maybe we will rent this out more often than we're actually in the home. So we just want to make sure that that is handled up front and we don't have any last minute situations. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I will hopefully see all of you who are still on next Wednesday for the final chapters of the purchase contract. I will send out all of this information later. If you do have questions, just reach out and let me know. But if not, enjoy your day, everybody.
Thank you, Leah.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
Leah.
Thanks,
Thank
Leah.
you.
Have a
Bye.
great
Have a
day.
good one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.